Amid this serene yet isolated countryside, my husband and I owned a house that would soon become notorious among paranormal investigators worldwide. It was Thanksgiving, and my sister Janine was visiting. Let me describe myself briefly. You can call me Amber. I'm a woman in my late 20s, and Janine and I are close siblings, even though we live in different cities most of the year. Our house had been unoccupied for some time, a silence that allowed something or someone to claim it as their own. When my family, my husband, our 7-year-old son, and I decided to return and make it our home once more, we were immediately struck by an unsettling sensation that hung in the air. The day was meant to be joyful, but the inexplicable unease clouded our hearts. Our loyal dog, Don, refused to enter the house. When we finally managed to coax him inside, he erupted into frantic barking, his fur bristling with terror. This happened several times during the day. That evening, drawn by his desperate whimpers and howls, I witnessed my dog attacking an invisible foe. He leapt into the air as if pouncing on a man's throat, but fell back, lifeless. When we picked him up, we discovered his neck had been broken, which had later healed, an inexplicable and eerie occurrence. To say that my husband, Janine, and I were perplexed would be an understatement. We were deeply disturbed, but had not yet considered the possibility of supernatural forces. However, one evening, as the darkness began to descend, the house was suddenly filled with horrifying shouts, groans, and disturbing laughter. These frightening sounds, heard by all of us, plunged us into panic. While seated in front of her mirror, Janine saw a man's hand on her shoulder, yet there was no reflection in the glass, and no arm or body was visible. My husband experienced what he was certain were bugs, crawling on him late one night whilst in bed, only to find that there was nothing there. I too observed inexplicable footprints forming in the garden path before me as I walked, yet no one was there. The fear was palpable, yet we tried to reason with ourselves, believing there must be a rational explanation. As unsettling as these occurrences were, they paled compared to the things about to happen. It was Thanksgiving, and we wanted to enjoy a hearty family meal together. But the following events would forever tarnish this day of gratitude. We were seated at the supper table with a couple of guests when our conversation was abruptly interrupted by a loud, intensifying groan that seemed to originate from the room above. It wasn't until one of our guests pointed out a stain on the tablecloth, resembling fresh blood, that we noticed a liquid slowly dripping from the ceiling above. It was so akin to freshly shed blood that it horrified us, and the Thanksgiving feast was abruptly abandoned. This gruesome occurrence, however, was only the beginning. The liquid wasn't the most unsettling part. The macabre form of horror and the dramatic manner in which it was presented disturbed us deeply. The thought crossed our minds that some dreadful act, a murder, had taken place in the room above us. Silence hung in the room as we sat there, faces drained of color, exchanging fearful glances. My son and I, recovering from our initial shock, fled the dining room, heading upstairs to the room directly above. Thanksgiving had turned into a nightmarish ordeal. We tore up the carpet, revealing boards soaked in that same chilling, red liquid dripping into the room below. Yet there was no explanation, no resolution to this macabre enigma. A medical examination later confirmed that the drink was human blood, casting a shadow of horror over our Thanksgiving celebration. This horrifying incident was the breaking point for my family. and we abandoned the house, finding refuge elsewhere. The creepy reputation of this place spread, and the site became avoided both day and night. The neglect that followed added to its oppressive aura, and many spoke of the heavy atmosphere that seemed to linger around it. Thanksgiving was meant to be a time of gratitude and togetherness, but for us, it became a terrifying chapter in our lives. Some years ago, while visiting relatives who live in an old hall in the north of England, I had a strange and weird experience. The house, Darkwater Hall by name, built in 1600, was long and rambling, with one room opening into another and with secret cupboards let into the panels of the walls. A lovely old-world garden surrounded the house, and beyond the park was a moat. My name is Eleanor, and the house in question has been in my family for generations. The chilling events that unfolded there during my stay that dark November were shrouded in an air of mystery, not unlike the history of the place itself. I had always heard from childhood that the hall was reputed to be haunted. Still, which was the haunted room, and what form the ghost took, somebody had never told me, and when I received an invitation to stay a few days in this fascinating old place, I accepted with pleasure. The bedroom allotted to me was a large, low-ceilinged room on the first floor. My sister, Amelia, was also visiting, and we had a close bond despite our differences. Amelia had an eye for tradition, and Thanksgiving was one of her favorite holidays. She found joy in the warm gatherings and abundant feasts. In contrast, I couldn't help but feel a sense of disgust when I saw people greedily stuffing their debaucherous faces, eyes dancing with gluttony, in the name of a celebration. It wasn't my cup of tea, but I cherished the moments spent with family during this time. The first 2 nights of my stay passed without incident, and the thought that I might be in the haunted room never entered my mind. The 3rd night approached, and the anticipation of Thanksgiving hung in the air. It was during this night that the strange occurrence transpired. I retired at 11:30 p.m. and soon fell asleep. I do not know how long I slept, but the sound of the extinguisher being lifted and dropped again awakened me. I listened for a moment, and then suddenly, I felt that something was being pressed over my mouth and that I was suffocated. I could not move or cry out and thought I was losing consciousness after what seemed like hours to me, but could not have been many moments. The terrible feeling passed, and I lay very still, waiting for the dawn. No sooner had my mind resumed a restful state that I noticed something thin and eel-like slithering against the wall nearest my bedside. Turning quickly, I beheld the most hideous figure of a woman. While her brow hung in heavy folds, the skin of her face was drawn back tightly over the cheekbones, her ferocious eyes and prongs of teeth making her like a wild beast. But in all the horror of that moment, I did not lose my presence of mind. I pulled the bed covers aside and sprang towards the door, but it was too late. The key within fell to the floor, and now the detestable thing stood before me, from which I recoiled, the cry in my throat strangled by sheer horror. Was it human, that dreadful creature, in the grotesque likeness of a woman, with long arms and hands like yellow claws, wild, unkempt gray hair, and ragged garments hanging on its bony frame? It mouthed and gibbered like a monster, to such a point that its head almost rocked clean from its shoulders, and its eyes gleamed with the ferocity of madness, and it chuckled hoarsely to see its victim. It felt like forever that I stood petrified. The creature, my tormentor, meant murder, and what was my strength against that of those long, wiry arms and lithe fingers? Then, for a moment, it grinned and rejoiced in its triumph. The next, it would spring. But in that frightful pause, There were heavy steps outside the door. The creature heard it and uttered a loud yell of terror. It seemed for a moment to be almost paralyzed, but it was only for a moment. It evidently possessed, shrank back to the gray chasm from which it had entered this world. Not caring to risk a repetition the following night, I returned home. The story goes that a century previously, a woman had been murdered in this room by being smothered with pillows while lying on the right side of the bed. It was further revealed that the woman knew her murderer and had some foreknowledge of her demise. With the dreadful deed impending, she had brought her sisters, when she was dead, to cut her head from her body and preserve it within the mansion's walls, there to let it remain for all time. It is said that in the years following the terrible event, the skull had been removed more than once by members of the family who made light of what they considered a stupid belief, but there was never any luck with the house until it was returned. It so happens that the current resting place of the skull, a family vault in the local church, is at some considerable distance from the house. The story of Darkwater Hall, its mysteries, and the frightening legend of the haunted room continues to cast a shadow over the old family mansion as Thanksgiving approaches each year.